IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to yet another Friday episode of All Things Policy. As you know, we tend to talk about a little off-the-beat topics on Fridays. We tend to dive into India's history and rich culture. Last week, I looked at the story of Mir Mast, this soldier of the British Raj who ended up getting involved in one of the most dramatic and probably important diplomatic missions of the entire First World War period. Today, we're going to be looking at something totally different. I have with me today my friend Karthik Malli. Karthik is an independent researcher and journalist who is working on a book for Western Books. He's been published in The Caravan, The Deccan Herald, and First Post. We'll have a few links to his work in the description, so you can go and check them out if you find this conversation interesting. What we're going to be talking about today is one of the most fascinating but also most neglected languages in modern India. That is the language that is called Dakhni. Now, a lot of you might have heard the term Dakhni. A lot of you might think that, what is spoken in South India is just a variation of Urdu. It's merely a dialect of Urdu. It might be Chennai Urdu or Hyderabad Urdu or Gulbarga Urdu or whatever. But it's Urdu, and it's something that's overwhelmingly spoken by Muslims. It's not really related to Hindi. It's this whole different other language. But Dakhni actually has an extremely fascinating history behind it, and it's connected to some of the most important polities that once ruled over the Deccan and southern India. So for a little bit of context first, sometime in the 14th century or so, when the Delhi Sultanate had just about managed to overpower the Mongols and was looking to kind of project its enormous military power somewhere else, it began to look towards southern India. In a series of campaigns over the first half of the 14th century, a number of fairly remarkable generals, including the Gujarati eunuch Malik Kafur and the Delhi Prince Ulugh Khan, who later became Muhammad bin Tughlaq, led a series of campaigns deep into South India that totally upended the political and military balance and led to the collapse of some of southern India's most vibrant kingdoms, including the Hoysalas and the Kakatiyas and, of course, the Sayona Yadavas. Now, all of these kingdoms had been doing some fairly interesting stuff in the centuries leading up to Delhi's invasion. All of them were heirs to the great Kalyana Chalukya Empire that once dominated most of southern India, south of the Narmada, excluding, of course, the Tamil regions, which were controlled by the Cholas and Pandyas. Now, all these three kingdoms, the Kakatiyas, the Sayona Yadavas, and the Hoysalas, were very much what we would call regional kingdoms, in the sense that they extended their control over a broadly linguistically coherent region. Within this linguistic region, there would be variants of a particular language that was spoken. So the Kakatiyas ruled over most of modern Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. Within this region, there were many, many variants of Telugu that were spoken, but it was broadly a Telugu-speaking polity that kind of encouraged Telugu literature. The same goes for the Hoysalas with Kannada, and the same also goes to some extent with the Sayona Yadavas and Marathi. Now, what happens when you introduce this radically new kind of polity, this Sultanate polity into southern India? To an extent, many of the Sultanate state systems of the 14th, 15th centuries were very Persianized, right? So if you look especially at this mad genius called Muhammad bin Tughlaq, what he attempts to do in the Deccan is nothing short of trying to establish a totally new kind of revenue farming state. He tries to erase all vestiges of Sayona Yadava and Kakatiya power. He imports a lot of northern Indians and a lot of Persians to kind of man his garrison towns, his mint towns, and extend for the first time the authority of Delhi, this city that was hundreds of miles away, into this warlike and contested region. It was an experiment that totally failed, of course. Within 30 years or so, Delhi forces already been kicked out of the Deccan, and new sultanates were being formed here, particularly centered initially around Devagiri / Daulatabad, and soon after that in Gulbarga, which became the capital of the Bahmani Sultanate, which eventually then fragmented into 5 smaller sultanates, the sultanates of Ahmednagar, Bidar, Berar, Golconda, and of course Bijapur. Now, these 5 sultanates were competing with the equally vibrant, equally new cosmopolitan empire of Vijayanagara south of the Tungabhadra River. And keep in mind, these guys are the contemporaries of the Spanish Empire, upon which the sun never set. They were the contemporaries of the Portuguese. They were the first really gunpowder using states in the Indian subcontinent, and they were also among the most militarily innovative in the subcontinent. But their innovation was not confined merely to the military space. You can hear a lot about like the history of these innovative states in my Yuddha podcast. You might have heard it already. It's something I host with my fellow colleague at Takshashila, Aditya Ramanathan. But what Karthik and I are going to be looking at here in this episode is something much more interesting that all these polities are doing, namely the evolution of a totally new language. When you import all these northern Indians who speak Persian, who speak variants of Central Asian languages, who speak variants of this North Indian vernacular, which in some ways is similar to Hindi, and you put them in South India among a populace that speaks primarily Dravidian languages, not the Indo-Aryan languages of the north, but Dravidian languages which have a totally unique kind of etymology, a totally unique kind of vocabulary of sounds, you start to see the emergence of a new kind of vernacular, something that not only incorporates the influence of this broader Islamic yet Persianized global system in which the Sultanates and Vijayanagara found themselves, but also includes elements of this much older, vibrant regional literary tradition that the Deccan Plateau already had, as I mentioned. So what we're going to be doing over the next half an hour or so is really talking about this language called Dakhni, debating whether it should be considered a language of its own, what is it that really makes a Dakhni stand out, and what are the things that make Dakhni's history worth remembering? What does it really tell us about the complicated and vibrant history of the Sultanates that once ruled in the Deccan? So on that note, welcome Karthik to All Things Policy.
Hey Anirudh, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So let's get straight to it. Let's try to understand broadly the linguistic context first. Now, I'm not an expert in linguistics. You write quite extensively about linguistics of southern India, especially the Tulu regions, the Konkani regions, and of the Beri language in broadly Tulunadu. But let's talk today about Dakhni. Can you help us understand, first of all, as somebody who reads and writes about linguistics, what is Dakhni's scene? How can we best understand Dakhni's vocabulary, its sounds? What are the influences that this language tries to incorporate? And where can it be found today?
Right. That's a good question. And to understand this better, it's important we look at the history of the language itself, right? So today, Dakhni is spoken across the Deccan from from the northern reaches of Maharashtra and even the southern parts of Madhya Pradesh, like Burhanpur, all the way south to northern Tamil Nadu. So even in Chennai, for that matter, Dakhni is spoken by a sizable community. Its geographical distribution is quite wide because the Deccan is a huge region, right? It's primarily spoken by as a mother tongue by the region's Muslim communities. Since they form a minority across most of the Deccan, except in some urban areas, the language is wherever it is spoken, it is a minority language. So a Dakhni speaker, any given Dakhni speaker outside of let's say these cities, necessarily have to interact with people who do not speak Dakhni natively, right? So let's say a Dakhni speaker in Chennai, for that matter, would speak Tamil with her non-Dakhni speaking neighbors.
It's interesting that you mentioned that Dakhni is a language of the cities because
right.
Does that in any way kind of correspond to the settlement pattern and political strategy of the Sultanates, where they were primarily urban polities that kind of extended their control over the countryside through local lords who very often were not Muslims and who would have continued to speak the local language?
So you could actually say this because we have records from British times telling us that, so this is a case study for Bijapur district. and not for the whole Deccan, but I think it would be, it wouldn't be unreasonable to imagine that this would broadly apply to the Deccan as a whole. But we have records affirming that Muslims in the countryside generally spoke the local language, but they were already, but many communities spoke Dakhni with outsiders, or they spoke it in urban areas, or they spoke it in the markets. So there was also, there was already this sort of, distinction, right, between the local language and something that was tied to a more urban identity. And as you put it, right, like Sultanate power was concentrated in these urban areas. So, for example, like this case study is from Bijapur district, and it's from the 1880s, right? This is from historian Richard Eaton's first work, The Sufis of Bijapur. And he references these British records. And Bijapur obviously was a major seat of Sultanate power, since it was, the capital of the Bijapur Sultanate, right? And you can see this identification with Persianate culture and urban identity most strongly in regions that were that saw longer traditions of such elite culture, like Hyderabad, which firmly embodied this below until like the 1950s, right? With the reorganization of states. You would see it less in places like Tamil Nadu or, interior Andhra Pradesh, right?
It's fascinating, but we'll come back to that a little later.
Right.
But you were saying something about how a Dakhni speaker might very often speak Dakhni at home, but might speak Tamil to her neighbors, for example. So can you continue with that line of thought?
Yeah. So let's establish one thing, right at the very beginning. Languages in India are constantly in contact with one another, right? As much as linguistic nationalists today may look at that with some sort of tradition, with some form of hostility or shame, right? But Indian languages throughout history have been marked by this, degree of contact, linguistic contact, and linguistic contact is something that linguists do study and do, it's something that they do acknowledge, and it's been very important in the development, the trajectories of various languages. For example, if you take Marathi, which was the local language of Devagiri / Daulatabad, right? Marathi is an Indo-Aryan language, yes, but it is heavily influenced by Dravidian. So, in fact, the current consensus is that the Marathi-speaking region must have undergone a language shift from Dravidian languages to Indo-Aryan Prakrits, which then evolved into Marathi, right? And which is why if you look at Marathi even today, you have a lot of Dravidian. You have a lot of Dravidian words, yes, but looking beyond words, you would have Dravidian influenced grammatical patterns, some features in its phonology, and even culturally, you have a lot of things, and so markers of this influence are everywhere, right? And a lot of them are actually quite well documented by linguists. And I'm not going to get into those because they're highly specific, and you'd get into syntax and whatnot. But for now, I think understanding that language contact is a dynamic process and a constant process is something that we need to establish.
Yeah, I think that's definitely worth making very clear, Karthik, because there is quite a trend on Twitter where you and I both spend a lot of our time that insists that particular regions of India have always had the same language for all of eternity, and that language is pure and unchanging, or is descended from only one language and has absolutely no other influences, and that the boundaries of modern states correspond exactly to medieval linguistic regions, and that people have never moved in and out of those regions, which of course is really not supported by it's not supported by evidence from the period. We know of many great movements of people across the across the subcontinent. It's not just, and it doesn't happen purely in the wake of political invasions, but also happens because of just the normal rhythm of life through trade, through the migration of peasants searching for more fertile lands. So yeah, absolutely, that is definitely worth establishing right up front. And Marathi is a very interesting case. I apologize to my listeners for going on a bit of a tangent here, but that's very interesting that you mentioned that it's this Dravidian. There seems to have been a Dravidian substrate which eventually began to pick up like this Indo-Aryan Prakrit, right? How could that have happened? Like we know that by the early century CE already, the Satavahanas that ruled over the Maharashtra region are using Prakrit in their inscriptions, while the Shakas, these Scythians who ruled over Gujarat at the time, are starting to use Sanskrit as a courtly language. So clearly, this transition towards using Prakrit had already happened by then. But it just seems a little incredulous to me that a polity so early on in the timeline, in the freaking 2nd century, would have had anywhere near the wherewithal to kind of import masses of people who could speak another language and kind of settle them there and accomplish the shift. So clearly, there were probably less directed migrations that had already been happening, perhaps along the Buddhist circuit, over the last few centuries into Maharashtra by that point. And again, it's so fascinating because just a few centuries after that, already by the 7th century, you have these polities that are based in northern Karnataka, who, though they ostensibly use Sanskrit as a court language, in practice are basically Kannada speakers who are now taking over Maharashtra. And while they continue to use Sanskrit in their court literature till almost not the 9th century, perhaps ruled over regions of that were already speaking some kind of Proto-Marathi, and were kind of intermingling that with a spoken form of Kannada, which we don't really have a lot of records of. It's so fascinating to think about all the vectors that go into establishing a particular linguistic heritage. But as I said, we're getting distracted. So let's come back once again to Dakhni.
Sure. You're absolutely right. And I think, so despite this being a tangent, it actually has a link to this as well. To the case of Dakhni. So, we already spoke about how Dakhni was initially an urban language, right? And starting out, the base of Sultanate power, or rather Indo-Persian political power in the Deccan was Daulatabad and some of like these regional outposts, right? But then, many centuries later, you see it being spoken even in the hinterlands, right? So, and obviously, like you said, like it's not like people were imported, quote unquote, imported from Delhi, in huge numbers, right? So
yeah, at most they would have been members of like a few garrison towns, and as I said earlier, right? It's the Delhi's dominance of the Deccan lasts for barely 30 years. Within 30 years, these guys are being packed off by these local warlords, and of course by their own commanders who are trying to establish these new polities. But I think at this point, Karthik, it's worth kind of establishing a little bit about the political context of the Sultanates themselves, right? As I said a little earlier, they're part of this broader Persianized Islamicate world. And a great example of this comes not necessarily from the Sultanates themselves, but from their neighbor, Vijayanagara, where the emperors took upon themselves the title of Hindu Raya Suratrana, basically a sultan among the Indian kings. Not necessarily because they are trying to depict themselves as Muslims, but rather because the title Sultan and the kind of dress code that is now associated with the courts of the Sultanates, particularly the use of this tall conical cloth hat called the golai, and the cotton robe called the kabaya, have become more or less standard practice towards this huge trading network of the Indian Ocean, analogous to us sitting at home and speaking Telugu or Kannada or whatever, and putting on a suit and speaking English when we go to business meetings. That's exactly the same thing that Vijayanagara is trying to do. And especially for the Sultanates, right? Because they are not just part of the political world of this Persianized sphere, but they are also part of the religious world. We know of quite a few sultans who send their bodies to be buried in tombs in Karbala. when ISIS took over Karbala, like I had a mini heart attack when I read about it, because there's a lot of Indian sultans who are buried there,
Right. I
guys
think
who very materially.
The Golconda,
Yes, the Golconda, exactly. The Golconda Sultans, quite a lot of them sent their bodies to be buried
right.
there. A lot of these Deccan Sultanates were very consciously Shia Muslims.
Yes.
Keeping, basically staying, which was something that the Empire of Persia, Iran at the time was following, and which was not what the empires of northern India,
the
Mughals, were following. And in a lot of ways, these guys were kind of emphasizing their Shia-ness and their Persian-ness as a kind of, trying to basically flip off the Mughal emperor.
Right.
So these guys, again, it kind of like brings into question this very black and white view that a lot of people have, which is that Islam in India was always a kind of monolithic entity. Clearly, it's not. The Deccan Sultanates absolutely hated the Mughals.
Right.
And their hate of the Mughals, I think, also ties into the story of Dakhni at some point.
Absolutely. So, okay, like let's dispel some, like while we're at it, let's dispel some more misconceptions, right? So, far from being a sort of errant variant of North Indian Urdu, Dakhni, in its through language contact, right, incorporated numerous features, local features, right, and I'm talking about linguistic features of the Deccan, right? Like, so you can think of the Deccan as, or most of South Asia for that matter, but let's focus on the Deccan. You can think of the region as a sort of linguistic macro region, right? Like, sure, they don't speak the same language, but they speak various languages that have been influenced by, like, that share many features, right? For that matter, even Marathi, which is genetically unrelated to the Dravidian languages, has a lot of, it has a Dravidian substrate, right? Because of its history. So what happens is, shortly after the introduction of the speech of Delhi into the region, right, speakers start interacting with local languages, and like this language that was translated from Delhi starts incorporating these features, and in effect, it's pulled into this larger macro region. So as opposed to like a language that's sort of unrelated to, or rather disconnected from what's going on around it, it becomes very much a part of this dynamic network of languages spoken in the Deccan, and it starts incorporating, and again, it's a minority language, right? Sure, like it has, it's spoken by people with political power, but at the end of the day, it's a minority language. It's only spoken by the elite. So just as Indian English starts picking up, it's been picking up local influences for over a century now, you start seeing this language of Delhi, let's call it Hindavi, right? It starts picking up numerous local influences. And you have, you start seeing Dravidian influences. And so here's another thing, right? We don't have records of this process. We know for a fact that it's happened because we have the end product of these processes. So we can't point to let's say like a certain point in time and say, hey, this is when so-and-so started happening, right? But, and also, because most written records were still in Persian. So we can't see these changes happening in Dakhni, but we know for a fact that they have happened because we can see the end product of all these changes and all these processes over centuries, right?
That's fascinating. I really like the example of Indianized or just Indian English that you've given, Karthik, because it's very similar in a lot. It actually does work very well within the context of Deccan Sultanates because, as I alluded to earlier, these guys see themselves very much as part of this Persianized world.
Right.
There's a massive demand in their courts for Persian talent, for people who can speak and write well in Persian.
Even Hafiz, for that matter.
Sorry?
Even Hafiz, the iconic Persian poet from Shiraz, was invited to the Deccan by one of the Bahmanis.
Fascinating. And one of the Bahmani's most famous prime ministers, Mahmud Gawan, a guy who like profoundly kind of reworked the entire administrative structure, was, if I recall correctly, an Azerbaijani who had like family all over like Persia and Syria, Iraq and Egypt. And was also very much like a member of this very Persianized kind of world, which is it's a fascinating kind of parallel to, let's say, the 17th, 18th century, when you would have seen like a lot of these Indian courts kind of trying to get their hands on Western talent. And a lot of this Western talent would have been like kind of resisted by entrenched power structures within these Indian courts themselves, who by then were thoroughly native. And you see the exact same thing happening with the Deccan Sultanates themselves. So imagine that you're working in a company today that has quite a liking for British people and keeps importing British people. And these British people speak a different kind of register, a different kind of language of English, but you speak Indian English. They're not something you're entirely going to be happy about. Both those traditions, right? Both just as Indian English and the quote-unquote Queen's English can coexist, similarly within the courts of the Deccan Sultanates, Persian and Dakhni very much coexisted and were constantly kind of wrangling for dominance over the other. So can you give us a few examples of how exactly this process worked? You talked about how this Delhi-based language, which we're calling Hindavi, picked up influences from all the regions that it was a part of. So, for example, was the variant of Dakhni that was spoken in Ahmednagar different from what was spoken in Bijapur? Was that different from what was spoken in Golconda, for example? Because unlike all the other Sultanates, actually aggressively kind of patronized Telugu literature. And so I can imagine that Golconda Dakhni must have had a lot of influences of like this courtly Telugu, which might not necessarily have happened with the other Sultanates. So how exactly did this whole thing pan out?
So, I mean, you can also look at literary traditions. So they weren't independent because obviously they were, influenced by one another. But at the same time, they did sort of establish boundaries, I guess. Like sometimes you would have a poet who knew, like, let's say, Telugu and Sanskrit, but there would be many elements of his Telugu poetry that would not be derived from Sanskrit. And so the cross-pollination between Dakhni and local languages in the literary sphere has not been explored much. But in the linguistic sphere, it's quite evident, right? It's been the primary focus of such studies. So to give you some background again on this, we could I think it helps to step back and look at the trajectory of Dakhni from a historical perspective, right? So let's get one thing straight, right? So Dakhni's history is intimately tied to the political history of the region, right? Because Dakhni was spoken by a political elite, right? And increasingly as time passed, by an urban elite, but still an elite. It was not the common language, right? So its existence, but also its propagation and its cultivation, right, was contingent on its political patronage, which was also the case with, let's say, something like Persian, which wouldn't have been spoken by the masses in any case, right? So what happens is whenever, so we don't another thing is we don't, like I mentioned earlier, we don't have texts in Dakhni for the early period. What we do have are certain brief references to Dakhni in Persian works by Sufis, where they say something like, there's like so and so people, like people use so and so term, or this is how they say, this is how they say something, or this is a phrase they use or whatever. But you only have these fragmentary sort of references, throwaway references almost to the language, as opposed to anything substantial. But this changes in the early 1400s, right? Under the Bahmanis, who had by then moved to Bidar. And you have this work of literature, which is quite singular in that it has no recorded precedent, right? Or even like successor for that matter. It's called Kadam Rao Padam Rao, written by Fakhruddin Nizami of Bidar. So we don't have the entire poem. It's I think it's missing the ending, the conclusion. So even its dating is sort of up in the air to some extent, but it seems to have been. It was composed in Bidar, and so it seems to be from the Bahmani period, most likely. And the thing is, the poem is in Dakhni, and it's the first record of, this first substantial record of writing in this language. And it, even in Delhi for that matter, the speech of Delhi was not used to this extent. So, this is a descendant of the speech of Delhi, But yeah, you have it being cultivated in Bidar, of all places, right? And the text itself is very esoteric because although Dakhni existed in a Persianate cultural sphere, the text itself, it derives heavily from Sanskritic traditions. And in fact, the text itself incorporates so many Sanskrit words that I've often heard from scholars of Dakhni that if you are to read, if you just know Urdu and Dakhni, if you read Kadam Rao, Padam Rao, you don't really, you won't understand enough because it's so Sanskritized. You need like a dictionary, right? And this sort of offers hints as to what sort of, I guess, cultural amalgamation would have been taking place at the time. Because, like decades after the Bahmani break with Delhi and its political models, they obviously needed to reinvent themselves and cast themselves as, Deccan rulers, right? Their ties with Persia notwithstanding. Obviously, a significant part of this process was by reinventing, or rather by turning their gaze inwards, right, so to speak, and looking at the Deccan as, a region of their own. And you actually, and this is hardly unique, right? You actually see similar processes in other regions like Bengal around the same time, and these accelerate after, these regions break off from Delhi in the wake of Timur's invasions, right? So, in fact, this is something that's being studied in more depth by scholars of comparative literature, right? Anyway, coming back to Kadam Rao, Padam Rao, the very name is interesting, right? Kadam Rao. First off, there are no Muslim characters in the text, so they all have Sanskrit names or Tadbhava variations of Sanskrit names, right? For example, Kadam Rao is a Dakhni form. Like if you were to convert it, so to speak, or rather translate it to Sanskrit, it would be Kadamba Raja, right? And this is through regular processes of sound shift and whatnot. So you would have Kadamba Raja. And what's interesting is and I'm sure you know this, one of the most important dynasties of the Deccan, right, were the Kadambas. So, is the name a coincidence? We don't know, but it's definitely an important link.
It's so interesting you mentioned that because at the same time as a lot of these regional sultanates were looking inward,
right,
and incorporating influences from the older Sanskritic courtly culture.
Right.
At the same time, in Indian inscriptions, especially in Sanskrit, you see the resurgence of these new names like Surat Rana and Hambira.
Yes.
Not necessarily as titles, but as personal names. Which kind of shows you that just as these ostensibly globe-facing sultanates were also looking inward, these ostensibly inward-looking Indian kingdoms were also looking outward and incorporating a lot of these new influences. Yeah. So it's really very much a bi-directional process.
Absolutely, and in fact, I think that would be a great topic by itself. There's so much to be said about that. I think the Deccan was uniquely poised for this sort of cultural innovation because even though, the Deccan Sultanates and the Bahmanis were powerful, they had to contend with some formidable foes, right? Namely Vijayanagara and then later the Nayakas that followed. But at the same time, they had to assert their independence and they had to so basically they had many reasons to look inwards and many reasons to sort of forge a new identity for themselves that was rooted in the Deccan, right? And one of the ways they did this was through Dakhni literature. One of the most fascinating developments of the medieval Deccan, right, is so shortly after the Bahmani states splintered into these 5 sultanates, these sultanates started competing with one another, not just the Vijayanagara kings, but also one another, right? And then this process of inward almost introspection became heightened, and what you see is an increasing focus on identities that are even more local. Instead of the Deccan, you would have a focus on Telangana, and I'll get to that soon.
See, once again, that's a really fascinating parallel to what happened with this cosmopolitan Sanskrit world, and the evolution of India's regional languages before the arrival of Hindavi speakers in the Deccan, right? Because especially if you look at Karnataka, as I said a little earlier, in the 7th, 8th, early 9th centuries, overwhelmingly you see inscriptions that are made in Sanskrit. Clearly, the elite, the military aristocracy of the Deccan at that point wanted to display themselves as being part of this broader Sanskritic world, the Sanskritic cultural and trading world that was kind of centered in northern India. But as time goes on and as their own lands seem to become more populous, as they want to appeal not so much to this trans-subcontinental elite such as Brahmins and literati, but more towards their own kind of local military warlords, they start to patronize Kannada and try to emphasize their identity as regional polities. So once again, it is just so fascinating to see the same kind of rhythm of history repeating itself, where what's happening is that the Deccan Sultanates, after a couple of centuries of aggressively trying to present themselves as part of a Persianized world, are now trying to look inwards and are trying to emphasize their identity as regional polities, as sons of the soil, as it were.
So I think it would help to step back and look at some of the internal divisions within the Deccan Sultanates, right? So there were two factions at the courts of both the Bahmanis and the Deccan Sultanates. One were the Afakis, we call them Afakis, the foreigners, right? So the Persians and, the migrants from outside the Deccan. And they were in constant conflict with the Dakhnis, who were locals, right? So they were local converts, the descendants of settlers from Delhi, and others who had who had come to identify with this broader milieu, including, interestingly enough, slaves from Africa. So, yeah, so they identified more with the Dakhnis than they did with the foreigners, even though they were technically not from the Deccan themselves, right? Because they
so racism is clearly not an invention of the modern world.
Yeah. An interesting development that sort of pushed forced the hand of these rulers to look further inwards was the expansion of the Mughals, right? And much like the Delhi Sultanate before them, the Mughals, after consolidating their rule in their own, rather in the environs of Delhi, looked towards the peripheries of that region, of the broader, North Indian region, and went on to conquer, Gujarat and Bengal and Kashmir. And then what was next was the South. And, that was they set their sights on the South, on the Deccan, right? And this took some time. So, it didn't happen overnight. And in fact, Akbar began this process, and it only ended with Aurangzeb, generations later, right? Anyway, so after the defeat of Vijayanagara, so the Deccan Sultanates banded together to decisively rout and defeat Vijayanagara at the Battle of Talikota, right? And what happened was the plunder from Vijayanagara was quite significant, right? It was one of the richest cities in the Deccan. And it actually sparked an efflorescence of literature, of culture, of, art, of architecture across the Deccan, but primarily in Golconda and Bijapur, which were the two largest beneficiaries of the fall of Vijayanagara, because they also, especially Bijapur, they were also set to annex a lot of former Vijayanagara territory. In fact, the Bijapuris reached as far south as Chennai. They had a good time, I guess.
I think this is time for a little bit of self-promotion. Bijapur is a very interesting city to me because both it and Vijayanagara are basically cities of victory, right? Both of them
yes.
Fundamentally mean the same thing.
Yes.
And somehow, though Bijapur was empirically the most successful of the two, as you said, they're the guys who win. They're the guys who actually managed to import gunpowder, successfully innovate with cannon, artillery, and musketry.
Right.
And are by far the more successful of the two cities of victory. Yet today, Vijayanagara is the one that dominates our historical consciousness, while Bijapur is no longer even called Bijapur officially. It's called Vijayapura, as though the Sultanate history is not worth remembering in its own home ground. So I have this series of podcasts, Yuddha, the Indian Military History podcast. We're doing a 3-episode series on like the intertwined destinies of Vijayanagara and Bijapur, which we'll have a link to in the description as well. So listeners, if you find this conversation interesting, you might want to go and check that out. But yeah, let's come back to the Sultanates once again. So Karthik, you've told us about how the Sultanates managed to defeat Vijayanagara, and obviously, as most medieval polities tend to do, they ruthlessly sack the city and like take away like a whole bunch of money. At the same time, their competition with the Mughals is trying to heat up. So what happens next?
Right. So something that's often overlooked in the context of Talikota and the subsequent sacking of Vijayanagara is that it wasn't just like looting by the victorious powers, right? You also saw this. So a lot of these craftsmen, a lot of artisans, and a lot of basically a lot of people involved in cultural production in Vijayanagara were left without patrons, right? And a lot of them gravitated towards Bijapur, and you start seeing a lot more Indic motifs, right? Sanskritic motifs in art. I am not as familiar with art history, but there's been quite a lot written about this in recent times, especially, and there was even an exhibition on this curated, and I think it was at some fancy gallery in New York City.
Bijapur is a really interesting example because I don't recall the name of the Sultan. Maybe I think it was Yusuf Adil Shah. I'm not totally sure. But this chap commissions a book with illustrations of the goddess Saraswati wearing a Persianate robe and that kind of thing. So once again, trying to tie back to the overall theme of this podcast, the Deccan Sultanates are not in any way alien to the Deccan.
Absolutely,
they are very much, just as they are experimenting with the linguistic substrate of the Deccan, they're also interacting with the cultural ideas that have been there for much longer than they have, and are trying to kind of restate them in their own ways. They're innovating in their own ways, just like any other Indian polity would
do. It's very fascinating, and you have, and that's just it, right? This is hardly something that's limited to language, right? You see its imprint on pretty much everything that was produced in the sort of golden era of Bijapur that followed, the sack of Vijayanagara. So you have this is when you have an outpouring of literature, yes, but also art, music, painting, and crafts, and also architecture for that matter, right? And all of these forms display increasingly, apparent Indic/Sanskritic influences, right? And themes and motifs and whatnot. And different rulers chose to, interact with these in different ways. So this tradition sort of rose with zenith under Ibrahim Adil Shah II, who's quite he's popularly known as the Sultan who sang praises of Saraswati, and he actually did. So he literally wrote a Dakhni work, the Kitab-e-Nauras, in very Sanskritized Dakhni that begins with a hymn to Saraswati and Ganesha and and even the name Nauras, it's from the Sanskritic tradition of the Navarasa, right? And Nauras is the Dakhni equivalent of that. So you had multiple forms of this, and his own tomb for that matter, rather his mausoleum, Ibrahim Rauza, which is in Bijapur, and by far the most striking monument in Bijapur, even more so than the Gol Gumbaz in my opinion. Do not miss it if you're visiting Bijapur. It actually has temple pillars built in the imperial Chalukya style, the Kalyana Chalukya style, which was which long predated even the the Tughlaq expansions into the Deccan. So
it's fascinating. Once again, both Vijayanagara and Bijapur competed to kind of sees this Chalukya legacy, right? In Vijayanagara, you see this Chalukya style tank that you can still see today in the Royal Centre.
Right.
But in Bijapur, there are far more, and they also successfully controlled Kalyana, which was at the center of the Chalukya Imperium. So again, it never ceases to puzzle me that a sultanate which was speaking a local language and was expressing its kinship with a local polity, and was using local cultural and religious ideas in its intellectual works, is still somehow seen as alien and is still forgotten.
It's quite sad.
Yeah, it is an absolute tragedy. But let's try to just zoom out a little bit and once again try to talk about the oral story of Dakhni, right?
Absolutely.
So we've seen how Delhi comes in, they introduce Hindavi speakers. Hindavi speakers start to experiment with the local language. There are also like very substantial Persian influences that happen. There's all this politicking, this back and forth between Dakhnis and Afakis, and you see the evolution of like local strains of Dakhni, which slowly start to blossom in the aftermath of Talikota and the origins of like Mughal aggression against the sultanates of the Deccan. What comes after that? Why is it that we don't see great poetic works in Dakhni? How is it that a language with such a rich political and intellectual history behind it is today so often considered no more than an offshoot of Urdu, as it were?
So it's a great question, and like I'll try to break it down. So I mentioned that there was Kadam Rao, Padam Rao, the first recorded literary work in Dakhni, and it's quite singular in both its form and like even its very existence for that matter. But shortly after this, shortly after Talikota, and like along with the hand in hand with these other forms of cultural experimentation. You see, like this blossoming, as you put it, of new forms of Dakhni literature, right? So Bijapur and Golconda start producing many, numerous works of Dakhni literature, right? And what's interesting is many of these works go back to they emphasize and re-emphasize a local identity, and they're written in Dakhni, but you have distinct schools of Dakhni, like you have the Bijapuri school and you have the Golconda school, right? And they have different themes and even like linguistic patterns and whatnot. And for example, the Bijapuri one was more esoteric and like sort of flirted with spirituality more, and the Golconda one was more like geared towards like romance and stuff. So and you start seeing like a lot of references to the Deccan. For example, in one of the most important Dakhni poems from Golconda, the Kutub Mushtari, right, which is said to be an allegory of the romance of the Kutub Shahi Sultan at the time. This is from the late 1500s, early 1600s. So around the time Hyderabad was founded, basically, right? So you see increased references to the Deccan, and like these poems. For example, this very work, Kutub Mushtari. So it's basically a romance between Qutub, a Deccan prince, and Mushtari, who is from Bengal, right? And what's like hilarious to me, but also very telling, is that I have an edition of this epic translated into, or rather annotated in standard Urdu. So it's not in English, but it's in standard Urdu, which I can read. So I've been reading it over time, and like there's an entire page in my edition that is basically just this prince telling the princess Mushtari to move to the Deccan with him, or rather, join him in the Deccan, and he like goes on to list like these the features of the Deccan. So he uses like really flowery language where he's saying stuff like, the world is a ring, and the Deccan is, or rather, Telangana is the jewel set in the ring, and there's like no place on earth like Telangana. There's no place on earth like the Deccan, and the Deccan has its own charm. And it's literally an entire page of this. So,
That is just so fascinating. Like,
absolutely.
these polities are so often thought as just being these foreign invaders who don't belong at all. But
Right.
think of like entire pages and pages describing the beauty of the land that they see themselves as part of, which once again is analogous to this old process where at one point Indian courts would kind of commission Sanskrit Mahakavyas to establish their part of this cosmopolitan Sanskritic world, but then start to turn towards more regional languages to emphasize their identity as regional polities.
Even
the same thing happens
features,
with
for that matter.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, that's the same thing that happens with the Deccan Sultanates as well. So I mean, in every way, these guys are absolutely an Indian family of
Deccan,
polities.
Yeah, like very much a Deccan polity, and like it's fascinating because you see a lot of this, and what happens is with the by at the same time, like you have like political struggles going on, and like Ahmednagar is annexed, right, by the Mughals, and this sends the remaining sultanates by then it's just Bijapur and Golconda into a frenzy, and they're like, whoa, like these guys are they're an existential threat now. So what happens is the courts of of Bijapur and Golconda start turning to this identity more and more, and what's more is they start putting it in opposition to a North Indian, or rather Hindustani, like a Hindustani identity. So there are verses in Dakhni from Bijapur and Golconda saying stuff like, the Mughals are like, the Shagir, the disciples of Iblis, the devil, right, in Islamic mythology. So, and like stuff like treachery is in their very blood, and like all these, very, I would say hateful, but very, very like assertive and like very hostile, like sort of verses start coming out of the Deccan. And there are many of these. These aren't even like isolated, verses. And at the same time, like these guys are talking about the Deccan, and they're saying stuff like Dakhni is that language which the common man can understand. It's not Persian, it's not Sanskrit, but it's what we speak. And I mean, obviously, they're still talking about a certain Milo. It's not something the masses would have spoken, and it's okay to acknowledge that. But still, like it's interesting that they acknowledge that it's accessible as opposed to cosmopolitan Persian or Sanskrit, right? And in fact, there's also a Bijapuri poem that describes the city of Bijapur and its markets and its women, and it's quite interesting because they started seeing, they started I would say chronicling, but sort of building a sort of consciousness that was very much rooted in the Deccan and its traditions, and it harkened back to a certain past, and like this was complemented by its by the architectural and the other endeavors of these states. But the Mughals were like literally breathing down on their backs by this point, right? In fact, Aurangzeb set up camp, his second capital, in what is now Aurangabad, right? Which was actually a former capital under the Ahmednagar Sultanate, Aurangabad was was founded by Malik Ambar, who was an Ethiopian origin slave, right?
And who was also incidentally the originator of the guerrilla tactics that were later perfected by Shivaji.
Yes, the Bargir, the guerrilla tactics. Yes. So yeah, he set up camp in the city, and it became known as Aurangabad. But yeah, he had entered the Deccan as well, and at the same time, the Sultanates were also losing ties, or rather, their ties with the larger Persianate world were weakening because they no longer had uninhibited maritime access to Persia because the Portuguese had entered by that time, right? So their connections with the larger Persian world were weakening, and they had to the only identity they could sort of reemphasize and like sort of assert became the Deccan identity, and they did this with gusto, right? With such honestly, this is still being studied, and in fact, I mentioned the edition of Kutub Mushtari I have is in Urdu. That's because most of these translations are in Urdu, and most scholarly work on the on Dakhni literature is in Urdu, and it's not in translation. So If you want to read up on the political history or the linguistic history of Dakhni, you have English sources. But if you want to read the original texts or even the literary history, you have to turn to Urdu. And I mean, fortunately for me, I can read the language, so I've been doing that. But yeah, I can see how that is, a big roadblock for for people. And then yes, so as we've established repeatedly, Dakhni was intimately tied to the political fortunes of these Deccan polities, right? And what happens when they no longer exist? Well, we don't have to imagine because Aurangzeb finally managed to conquer both states, Golconda in 1687 and Bijapur in 1686. And, he immediately, to consolidate his own power in these regions, he immediately starts appointing, like governors from Delhi and basically, these outsiders who don't have a power base in the Deccan, right? And this is to replace the the formerly loyal families with his own governors, right? And what happens is none of these people, obviously since they're not from the Deccan, none of them care about Dakhni. So the tradition dies out, and it's pretty sad. It just it reaches an eclipse and it just sort of disappears for the most part, except for these small holdouts, which are essentially just regional courts that don't even hold that much power, like Arcad in Tamil Nadu, which is still a center of Urdu in the region. It's near Vellore and Ambur and Chennai. Yeah. And Channapatna, which is near Bangalore, but it's a really small town. So these were just minor, petty nobles or whatever, right? With their own courts, but none of them were significant enough. And that's kind of it. The tradition dies out. But post that, Dakhni begins to be identified with its, it loses its literary patronage and it just becomes a spoken language, right? With the rise of standard Urdu in North India, or rather literary Urdu in North India, in Delhi and Lucknow, the Muslim elite of the Deccan start identifying with that as well, even though what they speak is different and has a different history, right? And it's been divorced from Delhi for centuries. But what happens is they start identifying with that to the extent where when the Nizam of Hyderabad, and he, the Nizam was also the first Nizam was basically a governor appointed by Aurangzeb, right? So he did not have any connection to the Deccan either. So the Nizams of Hyderabad continued to appoint governors and, literati from the north, right? With no connection to the Deccan. So they actually make Urdu, standard Urdu, literary Urdu, their official language. And Dakhni, even under them, Dakhni has no patronage, even though the entirety of their realm is in the Deccan, right? So you have this sort of co-opting of Dakhni by elites who now identify with the Urdu, standard Urdu. And you see it to this very day, in fact. I mean, obviously now it's not an active identification, but, the roots, the seeds of this have been sown. So it's basically just a continuation of that tradition. Basically, if you trace the roots of Dakhni's marginalization back, you go all the way back to Aurangzeb's conquest of the region. So it just goes to show how tied, how inseparable the political and the linguistic are when it comes to Dakhni, right? Or rather the literary, because the language continues to be spoken, but it's the literary form that disappears.
What a fascinating story, Karthik. I mean, it's so easy to very often think of Urdu as the language of Indian Muslims.
Absolutely.
And as a rather dark corollary, Hindi as the language of Indian Hindus. But I think that our conversation has hopefully managed to establish that the real picture is far vaster and much richer with all these interactions and back and forths than it might seem at the surface, especially in our politically charged Twitter discourse. There is so much beauty and humanity in the history of all these languages. And yes, Dakhni does very much survive. It's very much this relic of a bygone age, of this brief period when, under the pressure of this northern invasion, all the sultanates of the Deccan engaged in this wave of regional pride, as it were, and as a kind of last hurrah before they were wiped out. And it is a great tragedy that Dakhni has never really returned to the position that it once held. In fact, it's we were talking about it before we started this recording, and you mentioned that it's not even considered to be a dialect, let alone official language.
Correct. It's not recognized by the census, but that's also a factor of its of its lack of self-identity among its own speakers. I would say, broadly speaking, apart from people who are sort of familiar with the region's history or whatever. And I think that's beginning to change, at least in Hyderabad. I mean, you do have some cultural production in Dakhni today, but it's very tellingly all comedic, forms of whatever, you have movies, you have poetry, you have skits and whatnot, but they're all comedic. For example, Danish Seth's videos have been going viral of late. He's a Bangalore-based, comedian, and he's from Bangalore cantonment, where Dakhni and Tamil are the primary languages. But I mean, he regularly employs Dakhni in pretty much every video. He even has characters who only speak in Dakhni, and he's been doing this for a long time, for years now. And I mean, again, these are comedic skits, and then you have movies from Hyderabad that have gone viral, that have a parallel Dakhni movie industry, right, which is completely online or whatever. But again, those are all slapstick comedies, very, very crass movies. I wouldn't recommend them if I'm being frank. But I mean, and then you had some satirical, you had some satire in Dakhni from Hyderabad, and again, they broadly fall under this comedic expression, and you wouldn't see Dakhni used in serious context, right? It's always seen as something that you can use to make people laugh, right? And I mean, I'm not judging its role there, but it's telling that it's the only role it has in the modern Deccan. And what's very interesting to me, and this is something that is very, very understudied. I had to trawl through tons of papers to find references to this, but there is one small exception to Dakhni's eclipse, and that is under Tipu Sultan, right? So Tipu Sultan inherited from his father, he inherited the courtly structure of the Mysore kings. And from what I understand, Hyder Ali did not change that much. He just changed who was at the head of whatever, he just changed who the ruler was. But Tipu Sultan did seek to reform or reinvent Mysore as a Deccan sultanate, right? And to that end, he did when his library was raided and catalogued by the British. They found numerous Dakhni works in his library, including a Dakhni Telugu dictionary and works by Golconda and Bijapuri poets, right? And court poets, right? Including sultans. So he had the Diwan of Muhammad Quli Qutub Shah, the founder of Hyderabad, and he had he had a bunch of. I mean, it pales in comparison to his Persian, collection. But he did have these books. I think they number 17 or something in total. And
fascinating.
And
here's another heretical thought about Tipu Sultan. The American historian Burton Stein makes the case that if you look at Krishnadeva-Raya, arguably the most famous of Vijayanagara monarchs, this guy's primary political project through his entire reign was to break the power of the landed military aristocracy.
Right.
And he did that through creating a new class of chiefs, namely the polygars, who basically these village chiefs who acted as warlords on Vijayanagara's behalf.
Right, yeah.
And one of the states that was primarily responsible for the decline of Vijayanagara power after the Battle of Talikota was Mysore.
Right.
Mysore, especially under the Wadiyars, rose up after the decline of the Umattur chiefs who Vijayanagara had destroyed under Krishnadevaraya.
Right.
So the destruction of the Umattur chiefs is what allowed the Wadiyars to take over Mysore and build this new kingdom and claim to be Vijayanagara's descendants.
Right.
But this project of breaking the power of the military aristocracy was once again kind of renewed under Tipu Sultan of all people, who actually managed to come very close to creating a centralized military bureaucracy under the leader of the state in a way that I think Krishnadevaraya would have been proud of. So once again, you see these interesting kind of back and forths and contradictions which really don't conform to a binary kind of view of history. But on that note, this has been, I think, by far one of the longest and most interesting All Things Policy episodes that I've ever participated in. Karthik, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Anirudh. It's been great fun,
We will have links to Karthik's writings in the description. And to hear more about the story of Vijayanagara and the Deccan Sultanates, please check out our Yuddha podcast. We'll put a link to that in the description as well. And I think that I'm not the only one who would be thinking now that we can't wait for your book on Dakhni to come out, Karthik. I think it's definitely going to be one of the most important works about the Deccan to come out in the near future. So thank you so much once again. Thank you for joining me, Karthik, and thank you all for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. So another really fun week on the network. I don't know if you saw this, but Varun Thakur was on Advertising is Dead. That was a really, really fun episode. Besides that, we've had some great guests all over the place. We had Ram Madhvani on Cyrus Says. We had Saurabh Mukherjee, a legend in the finance space. He was on Paisa Vaisa. He and Anupam co-written a book, so definitely do check out that episode and go buy their book too. I mean, that would be another great thing to do. Uncle Pleasted had a really, really cool episode with hosts of our other show, Mr. and Mrs. Binge Watch, Anirudh and Janice. They were talking about celebrity culture and how that's progressed for the last few years. And yeah, it's just been a really, really great week. One episode I did want to shout out. A couple of weeks ago, Pulyabazi did an episode which was just amazing. They were talking about the letters between Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore. Do check those out. Those were really good. And with that, hope to see you again next week.
Are you constantly seeking happiness? Wondering how to make the most of every day? How not to let your inhibitions stop you from achieving your goals? It's now time to get your A game on. It's time to unlock your true potential. Tune in to the Empowering series with me, Zarina Poonawalla, to feel empowered in all genres of life. From behavioral skills to management skills. From health to relationships. From mental well-being to emotional well-being. And of course, your finances. I've got you covered. With these tips and tricks from me, Zarina, and true life stories from my amazing guests, you're bound to bring your purest to the table. Tune in to the Empowering series with Zarina Poonawalla every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.